Picture this. You have spent the better part of 2 decades agonizing over a secret. You are sitting in your quiet country study, surrounded by thousands of pages of meticulous notes, and you know that what you are about to publish is going to fundamentally shatter how humanity views its place in the universe. It is a heavy burden. And then the morning mail arrives. You open a letter from a young, relatively unknown man who is recovering from a malaria-induced fever on a remote island halfway across the world. In just 20 pages, he has perfectly articulated your life's work. You are about to lose the credit for the greatest scientific discovery of the age. It is the ultimate intellectual nightmare. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are captivated by the untold realities of the past, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the truth behind the legends. We love to think of history as a clean, orderly progression. We imagine a genius looking through a microscope, seeing a cell dividing, and pointing to the absolute truth in a sudden light bulb moment. We want our history to be binary, but the reality is almost always a chaotic scramble. When you step into the world of Charles Darwin, that pristine microscope becomes entirely blurry. The historical landscape we are looking at is murky, contradictory, and deeply human. We are doing a deep dive into the complete, myth-busting life of Charles Darwin. A vast collection of personal letters, contemporary Victorian accounts, biological analyses, and historical records paints a picture that is way more controversial than the sanitized textbook version of history. The Darwin we all think we know, the solitary bearded sage standing on a volcanic island, having a sudden eureka moment about evolution, is largely a constructed narrative. It is a myth built after the fact to make the messy process of science look inevitable. We are going to tear down that constructed narrative, dissect the widely believed myths about his famous discoveries, look at the reality of his public debates, and dive into his personal tragedy to show you the multifaceted human being behind the iconic beard. To understand the revolutionary who changed the world, we must start with a surprisingly aimless young man. He wasn't born a legendary scientist. Darwin was essentially the 19th century equivalent of a wealthy kid finding himself on an extreme gap year, dodging his major and wasting his parents' money. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 into immense privilege, the product of 2 powerhouse families, the Darwins and the Wedgwoods of the famous Wedgwood pottery fortune. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a highly respected physician and poet who had dabbled in early, vague theories of evolution. The pedigree was definitely there, but Charles did not burst out of the gate as a prodigy. Originally, he was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine, entirely because it was expected he would follow in his wealthy father's footsteps. But he dropped out for a very visceral reason. You have to imagine medicine in the early 19th century, an era before anesthesia. Surgery was brutal, bloody, and agonizingly loud. Darwin, a highly sensitive young man, was completely traumatized by witnessing a botched surgery on a child. He couldn't stomach the screams. So, instead of going to his medical lectures, he just started skipping class. He walked along the tidal pools of the Scottish coast with a man named Robert Edmund Grant, investigating marine invertebrates and sea sponges. His father, Robert Darwin, was absolutely furious. He genuinely feared that Charles was going to become an idle sporting man, a rich slacker who spends his life shooting birds, riding horses with his dogs, and contributing absolutely nothing to society. Robert Darwin executed a massive course correction, pulling Charles out of Edinburgh and sending him to Christ's College, Cambridge. The new plan was for Charles to become a country parson in the Anglican Church. It is the ultimate historical irony. the man who eventually wrote the book that completely dismantled the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, was officially studying to be a clergyman. But in the context of the 19th century, it made perfect sense. Many of the preeminent naturalists of the era were members of the clergy, guided by a dominant philosophy called natural theology. The idea was that the best way to understand the mind of the Creator was to study His creation. If you study the intricate design of a beetle's wing, you are essentially reading the mind of God. Becoming a country parson was a perfectly respectable way for a wealthy young man to have a comfortable living while indulging in a passion for nature. Even at Cambridge, he wasn't hitting the books very hard. He was obsessed with collecting beetles, essentially acting as a giant biology nerd, hanging out with his professors. His deep connection with one specific professor, a botanist named John Stevens Henslow, changed the trajectory of his life. Henslow recognized that Darwin possessed an almost supernatural level of observational patience. When the British Navy was looking for a gentleman naturalist to accompany Captain Robert Fitzroy on a surveying mission to South America, Henslow recommended the 22-year-old Darwin. This began the legendary voyage of the HMS Beagle. However, the reality of this trip does not match the heroic myth at all. First, it was supposed to be a 2-year jaunt, but it ended up taking almost 5 years, from the end of 1831 to late 1836. Darwin's experience on the ship was absolute, unmitigated misery. The Beagle was a tiny wooden ship, roughly 90 feet long, packed with dozens of men. Darwin was violently, debilitatingly seasick. He endured weeks on end of vomiting, exhaustion, and physical despair. Out of the 5-year voyage, he spent an agonizing 18 months just at sea. It is no wonder he spent 3 years and 3 months of the voyage on land. He was literally running away from the boat. But it was during those land excursions that the real data gathering happened, bringing us to the most famous chapter of his life, and the biggest myth of all, the Galapagos Islands. The legend is deeply ingrained in our culture. The textbook version says, Darwin stepped onto the volcanic rocks of the Galapagos, looked up, saw finches with different beak shapes, instantly realized they had adapted to eat different foods, slapped his forehead, and shouted, "Eureka! Natural selection!" It is a beautiful story, and it is entirely 100% false. This myth reveals our desperate need for light bulb moments in science. The actual process of scientific discovery is rarely a sudden flash of insight. It is almost always a slow, messy process of retrospective analysis full of errors and missed opportunities. When Darwin arrived at the Galapagos in 1835, he was not looking for evolution. He operated under the assumption that these islands were geologically new, and he was looking for evidence to attach the local wildlife to an older center of creation on the South American mainland. He wasn't looking for a new paradigm. He was trying to fit new data into the old paradigm. He did notice strange variations. The local vice governor of the islands mentioned offhand to Darwin that he could tell exactly which island a giant tortoise came from just by looking at the specific shape of its shell. Some had dome-shaped shells, while others had saddleback shells that allowed them to reach higher vegetation. This was perfect evidence for geographical variation proving adaptation. He just needed to collect the shells and label them by island. But he didn't do that. Not only did he fail to collect the shells for scientific study, but Darwin and the crew actually brought these priceless, scientifically revolutionary giant tortoises on board the Beagle as living meat lockers. They kept them as pets for a little while, and then they ate them. They literally ate their best evidence and threw the shells overboard into the Pacific. They ate the eureka moment. Imagine trying to explain to a modern peer review board that the evidence was conclusive, but it was also delicious. The story gets even worse when we look at the famous Darwin's finches. The textbook says the finches were the key. They eventually became the key, but not while he was on the islands. While wandering the Galapagos, Darwin was an incredibly sloppy note-taker regarding the birds. He didn't correctly label which island each bird came from. More embarrassingly for a naturalist, he didn't even realize they were all finches. He misidentified them, thinking some were blackbirds, some were grosbeaks, and some were wrens. He completely missed the morphological significance while standing right in the middle of it. So, if he was eating the tortoises and misidentifying the birds, when did the puzzle pieces actually snap together? The breakthrough didn't happen on a sun-drenched island. It happened in a dusty, cramped room in London in 1836 after the voyage was over. Darwin handed his incredibly disorganized bird specimens to an expert ornithologist named John Gould. Gould did the microscopic, detailed anatomical work. It was Gould who came back to Darwin and told him that these weren't blackbirds and wrens. They were all closely related species of finches, entirely new to science and unique to the Galapagos. But because Darwin hadn't labeled where they came from, they couldn't prove geographic isolation. Darwin actually had to swallow his pride. He had to go to Captain Fitzroy and to his own servant, Sims Covington, who had also shot some birds, and borrow their properly labeled specimens. He essentially had to copy his captain's and his servant's notes to reconstruct his own data and figure out which beak shape correlated with which island's food supply. It really shows that science is a collaborative, retrospective puzzle where you don't know what data is important until after you've looked at all of it. If the Galapagos finches weren't the immediate trigger that made him realize life evolves, what was? The answer wasn't in the sky. It was in the dirt, the rocks, and the bones of a massive extinct monster. To understand how he arrived at the theory of evolution, we must shift our focus from biology to geology. The greatest intellectual influence on Charles Darwin during the Beagle voyage wasn't an animal at all. It was a book. Specifically, it was the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which the captain actually gave to Darwin before they set sail. To understand why Lyell was so revolutionary, you have to understand the prevailing geological theory of the time, known as catastrophism. Catastrophism argued that the Earth's features, its towering mountains, deep canyons, and vast continents, were formed by sudden, violent, and often miraculous events. People believed the landscape was carved by Noah's flood or massive divine earthquakes. Lyell argued the exact opposite, championing a concept called uniformitarianism. This meant that the exact same slow, natural processes we see operating today, like wind erosion, water carving a riverbed, or volcanoes slowly building up islands, have been operating at the exact same rate throughout all of Earth's history. Lyell argued that the Earth wasn't shaped by sudden miracles, but by slow, cumulative, microscopic changes over immense, almost unimaginable periods of time. Think of it like compounding interest in a bank account. If you look at your account day by day, nothing seems to be happening, and it looks totally static. But if you leave a tiny deposit alone for 1,000,000 years, suddenly you have an empire. Lyell proclaimed that the Earth is built on geological compounding interest. Darwin didn't just read about this compounding interest, he witnessed it firsthand. In 1835, while he was in Valdivia, Chile, he survived a massive earthquake. When the shaking stopped, he went to explore the coastline and found that the entire landmass had been physically thrust upward. He literally saw mussel beds, still clinging to the rocks, rotting in the sun 8 feet above the new high tide line. He saw the Earth move vertically in real time, realizing Lyell was absolutely right. If one earthquake can raise the coast 8 feet in a day, then 1,000 earthquakes over 1,000,000 years can raise the towering peaks of the Andes Mountains. Slow, incremental, natural changes create massive structural transformations. Here is the genius leap. Darwin takes that exact same mechanism, slow, incremental change over deep time, and he applies it to biology. If the Earth itself is fluid and changing, why wouldn't the animals living on it have to change to survive? This is where the giant fossils in Argentina come in. While digging in the cliffs of Patagonia, Darwin unearthed the fossilized bones of immense extinct mammals. He found the Megatherium, which was a giant ground sloth the size of an elephant, and the Glyptodon, essentially a heavily armored armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. The crucial thing wasn't just that they were big and dead. It was where they were buried. What struck Darwin with the force of a revelation was that these extinct giant monsters perfectly resembled the much smaller living sloths and armadillos that were currently scurrying around the exact same region of South America. He called this the law of succession of types. Think about the logic from a creationist perspective. If a divine creator is constantly wiping out species and creating new ones from scratch, why would he put the exact same structural design, just in a different size, in the exact same geographic location, across entirely different epochs of time? Why not put a giant kangaroo there instead? The fact that the extinct animals and the living animals shared the same unique geographic space strongly implied a bloodline. It implied lineage. The giant ancient animals were the direct ancestors of the modern smaller animals. They had changed through descent with modification. He sees the Earth changing slowly. He sees the fossil record, proving that animals change slowly in the same geographic areas. He gets back to London and Gould tells him the finches are all related, but adapted to different islands. He has the mechanism. He figures out natural selection by 1838 and writes a private sketch of the theory in 1842. And then, absolute silence. He doesn't publish On the Origin of Species until 1859, a staggering 20-year gap. If he had the golden ticket in his hands, why on earth did he wait 2 decades? The common narrative is that he was terrified of the church, paralyzed by the fear of being branded a heretic. This so-called Darwin's delay is one of the most pervasive myths in the history of science. It's a psychological drama we have projected onto him, loving the idea of the tortured genius hiding his explosive secret in a locked drawer because he's terrified of a Spanish Inquisition-style backlash. But if we actually look at the historical timeline and his personal correspondence, the fear narrative completely falls apart. He wasn't paralyzed by religious terror. He was simply working. He was incredibly busy, having just returned from a 5-year global expedition with crates and crates of specimens. First, he had to write and publish his exhaustive findings from the Beagle. He edited a massive multi-volume series on the zoology of the voyage, wrote an entire book explaining how coral reefs form, which is still respected today, and wrote a book on volcanic islands. He was establishing himself as a working geologist and naturalist. Then, right when he should be writing his evolution book, he spent 8 grueling years doing an exhaustive, microscopic, definitive study on barnacles. Just barnacles. While it looks like procrastination to us, to Darwin, it was essential armor building. He knew exactly how radical his theory of evolution was. And he knew that to challenge the entire foundation of biological science, he couldn't just be a well-traveled gentleman who had a neat idea about some birds. The scientific establishment would tear him apart if he didn't have absolute, unshakable credibility in taxonomy. the science of classifying living things. So, the barnacles were his proving ground. He realized that to prove species change over time, he had to deeply understand the minute variations within a single species right now. Barnacles were perfect, incredibly complex, highly varied, and frankly, a taxonomic nightmare. He spent 8 tedious years dissecting thousands of barnacles from all over the world, classifying every tiny structural difference. He discovered that the variations within a single barnacle species were enormous, blurring the lines of where one species ended and another began. This proved his point. Species are not fixed, rigid categories. They are fluid. He wasn't hiding his theory. He was building a fortress of empirical data, actively discussing natural selection with his inner circle, like the botanist Joseph Hooker and the geologist Charles Lyell. He wanted the book to be absolutely bulletproof. But as often happens when you take 20 years to perfect a project, the world does not wait for you. His comfortable, meticulous, barnacle-filled timeline was suddenly shattered by a piece of mail from the Far East. It is, without a doubt, one of the most dramatic, heart-stopping moments in the history of science. It is like 2 rival tech companies quietly working in secret for years, only to invent the exact same revolutionary smartphone on the exact same day. Let us set the scene. It is early 1858. Darwin is finally methodically writing out his massive multi-volume magnum opus, which he simply calls his Big Species book, taking his time. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, in the Malay archipelago of modern-day Indonesia, is Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace is a brilliant naturalist, but unlike Darwin, he is not a wealthy gentleman. He makes his living by braving the mud and the humidity of the jungle, collecting exotic specimens and selling them to museums and collectors back in England. Wallace, like Darwin, had been actively seeking the mechanism for how species change. One night, on the island of Halmahera, Wallace comes down with a severe, debilitating strain of malaria. He is bedridden, sweating, and delirious with fever. In the midst of this fever dream, the pieces suddenly snap together, and he connects the dots. As soon as the fever breaks, he scrambles out of his hammock and writes a brilliant, succinct 20-page manuscript detailing the exact theory of evolution by natural selection. And what does he do with this world-changing essay? He puts it in an envelope and mails it to the one senior scientist in England he thinks will understand and appreciate it, Charles Darwin. Imagine the devastating impact. Darwin sitting in his comfortable study, opening this letter and reading his own life's work, summarized perfectly by a stranger. Darwin essentially goes into a full-blown panic, writing a frantic letter to his friend Charles Lyell, stating, "All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." He notes that Wallace's terms now stand as the exact headers of his own chapters. It is his worst nightmare realized. 20 years of secret, agonizing work, about to be scooped by a guy who had a fever in Indonesia. If this happened today in the corporate world, it would trigger a billion-dollar lawsuit. Darwin, being the wealthy, established, connected scientist, easily could have suppressed the letter. He could have shoved Wallace's essay in a drawer, rushed his own book to the printer the next day, and stolen the sole credit forever. Wallace was thousands of miles away and would never have known until it was too late. But here is where the integrity of these Victorian scientists truly shines. Darwin is morally paralyzed. He wants the credit, but he knows Wallace deserves it too. He hands the ethical dilemma over to his friends, Lyell and Joseph Hooker, who devise an honorable compromise. On July 1st, 1858, they arrange for Wallace's essay, to be presented alongside unpublished excerpts of Darwin's writings from 1844 at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London. They force a tie, sharing the credit simultaneously. You would think this joint announcement of the secret of life would cause an immediate global earthquake, but ironically, it was met with deafening silence. The president of the Linnean Society actually gave a summary report at the end of the year and noted, rather grumpily, that the year 1858 had not been marked by any striking scientific discoveries. The presentation barely made a ripple. The greatest biological theory ever devised, and the reaction is a collective yawn. But the arrival of Wallace's letter accomplished one massive thing. It lit a fire under Darwin and forced his hand. He realized he could no longer spend another decade writing his encyclopedic big species book. He abandoned it entirely and spent the next 13 months furiously writing a condensed short abstract of his theory. That 500-page abstract was published in November 1859, and we know it today as On the Origin of Species. While their theories were presented together as identical, there were actually some deep, profound philosophical differences between Darwin and Wallace. It all came down to how both men read the work of an economist named Thomas Malthus. Malthus wrote an essay on population growth, based on the mathematical premise that human populations grow geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16. But the food supply only grows arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4. Therefore, eventually, population will always outstrip the food supply, leading to a permanent, inevitable state of famine, disease, and brutal competition for resources. Nature produces far more offspring than can possibly survive. A frog lays 1,000 eggs, but only 2 survive to adulthood. Both Darwin and Wallace read this and applied it to animals, but they applied it differently. Darwin viewed this Malthusian competition as happening primarily between individuals within the same species, a localized, individual struggle for existence. Imagine a pack of wolves. Darwin focuses on the fact that the slightly faster individual wolf will catch the rabbit, survive, and pass on its fast trait, while the slower individual wolf will starve. The individual is the unit of selection. Wallace, having spent years observing entire ecological systems in the tropics, viewed the competition through a demographic lens. He saw competition happening between populations or groups, arguing that a well-adapted group would outcompete and replace a poorly adapted group. Using the wolf analogy, Wallace would focus on how a pack of wolves that cooperates well together will outcompete a rival pack that doesn't cooperate, ensuring the survival of the entire cooperative group. It was individual selection versus group selection, a massive difference where Darwin looked at the savage competition between siblings, and Wallace looked at the survival of the collective. Their philosophical paths diverged even more wildly as they grew older. Wallace, despite being the co-discoverer of natural selection, ultimately hit a wall when it came to human beings. He looked at the sheer complexity of the human intellect, our ability for advanced math, abstract art, and complex language, and concluded that natural selection couldn't possibly account for it. He argued that an ape doesn't need to do calculus to survive in the jungle. Therefore, Wallace believed that while animals evolved naturally, a higher spiritual power must have intervened to guide the evolution of the human mind. He brought God back into the equation specifically for human brains. Furthermore, he became deeply, passionately involved in spiritualism, attending seances and trying to communicate with the dead, believing the spirit realm was actively shaping human progress. Knowing Darwin's obsession with purely natural, material explanations, this horrified him. Darwin felt his co-discoverer was betraying the very theory they had built. In fact, Wallace's pivot to spiritualism is what actively spurred Darwin to finally write his 1871 book, The Descent of Man. Darwin wrote it specifically to prove Wallace wrong, to meticulously argue that human beings, including our massive brains, our moral codes, and our social behaviors, evolved entirely through blind, natural processes without a shred of supernatural intervention. But before that book arrived, the explosive reaction to On the Origin of Species set the stage for one of the most famous and misunderstood showdowns in scientific history. The theory is finally out in the open. Origin of Species drops in 1859, and it sells out immediately. The public reaction is explosive. The world doesn't yawn this time. And this brings us to what is arguably the most famous showdown in scientific history. We have the legendary 1860 Oxford debate. It is framed in every history book as the ultimate smackdown between the light of science and the darkness of religion. In the red corner, we have Thomas Huxley, fiercely defending evolution and known as Darwin's bulldog. In the blue corner, representing the church, is Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam. The cinematic scene is set at the 1860 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, held at the newly built Oxford University Museum. The room is jammed with hundreds of people, hot and incredibly crowded. The legend goes that Bishop Wilberforce took the stage and delivered a sneering, arrogant, completely scientifically illiterate attack on Darwin's theory, relying purely on biblical authority and setting himself up to be the perfect villain. The myth says that at the climax of his speech, Wilberforce turns to Huxley on the panel and asks, dripping with sarcasm, whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that Huxley claimed his descent from a monkey. It was a direct personal insult about a man's grandparents in a stuffy Victorian academic setting, fighting words. Huxley supposedly turns to the person sitting next to him, whispers that the Lord hath delivered him into his hands, stands up, and delivers a crushing, impromptu retort. He declares that he would far rather be descended from a miserable ape than from a highly endowed man of influence who uses his great gifts to introduce ridicule and religious prejudice into a grave scientific discussion. It is the ultimate 19th century mic drop. The crowd allegedly goes wild, a lady literally faints from the shock, and Huxley single-handedly slays the dragon of religious obscurantism, leaving science victorious. It sounds like a scene written for a movie, but the historical records are flashing giant red warning lights all over this story. Very little of it happened the way we remember it today. History is written, and more importantly, rewritten by the victors. First, we must clarify the setting. It wasn't even a formal debate about evolution. It was a chaotic, open discussion period, following a completely different, rather boring paper about European societal development, read by a man named John Draper. More importantly, we need to completely reevaluate Bishop Wilberforce. The myth paints him as a religious zealot thumping a Bible, but the actual contemporary records reveal that Wilberforce offered strong, robust, and entirely scientific critiques of Darwin's theory. You have to remember that in 1860, nobody understood genetics. DNA hadn't been discovered. The prevailing theory of heredity was blending inheritance, the idea that offspring are a perfect 50-50 blend of their parents. Wilberforce brought up the massive problem of the sterility of hybrids. He pointed out that if you cross a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. But the mule is sterile. It's an evolutionary dead end. Wilberforce scientifically argued that crossing boundaries doesn't create vigorous new species because nature actively prevents it by making the offspring infertile. That is a completely valid biological objection for the mid-19th century. If hybrids can't breed, how do new species branch off? He also argued the problem of reversion to type. He pointed out that if you take highly modified domesticated pigeon breeds that humans have artificially selected and release them into the wild, they don't continue to evolve into crazy new forms. Within a few generations, they revert back to looking exactly like the standard wild rock dove. Nature has a rubber band effect that pulls variations back to a central norm. Furthermore, he argued there was no observational proof in the geological fossil record of these slow, minute transitions. As the fossil record showed species appearing suddenly, fully formed, Wilberforce wasn't just quoting Genesis. He was actively weaponizing the gaps in 19th century biology. In fact, Darwin himself later read a written review by Wilberforce detailing these exact points, and Darwin wrote a letter calling it uncommonly clever, admitting that the bishop had expertly picked out all the most conjectural, weakest parts of his theory. As for Huxley's legendary mic drop moment, the exact wording is lost to history because there was no verbatim transcript taken that day. But the most detailed contemporary journalistic account, published in the Oxford Chronicle, shows a much more polite, nuanced exchange. Wilberforce made a light-hearted joke about apes, which he later claimed in a letter was just playing to the audience's merriment. Huxley did make a sharp, defensive retort about preferring an ape to someone who misuses their intellect. So it happened, but it wasn't a decisive knockout blow. It was just a quick spar in a very long afternoon. The sources suggest that Huxley wasn't even the main event. Another scientist in the room delivered the most devastating defense of Darwin that day, and he has been almost entirely erased from the story. Joseph Hooker, Darwin's close botanist friend. According to multiple contemporary accounts, including Hooker's own letters, after Huxley and Wilberforce had their little spat, Hooker took the floor. Hooker gave a much longer, far more devastating, and rigorously scientific speech, methodically dismantling Wilberforce's botanical arguments piece by piece. Yet, Hooker is almost entirely forgotten in the popular myth. Here is the absolute kicker. When the meeting ended, both sides left the room genuinely thinking they had won. Wilberforce wrote a letter the next day saying he had thoroughly beat Huxley, while Huxley felt he was the most popular man in Oxford. We remember it today as an epic one-sided victory for science, because that specific narrative was deliberately constructed decades later by Huxley and his allies. In the late 19th century, a group of scientific naturalists, men like Huxley, who formed a group called the X Club, were fighting a massive cultural war to wrest educational and cultural authority away from the Anglican Church. It was pure politics. They wanted to professionalize science and secularize society. They weaponized the memory of the 1860 Oxford meeting, exaggerated Wilberforce's religious zealotry, and elevated Huxley's retort to mythic status to create a foundational myth of the warfare between science and religion. The false binary of pure science versus ignorant religion was a later invention to serve a specific political and cultural agenda, having survived the initial fallout of Origin of Species, and with his allies fighting the culture war. Darwin finally addresses the elephant in the room 12 years later. In 1871, he writes The Descent of Man, explicitly dragging human beings into the evolutionary family tree. But reading this book brings up a huge, baffling paradox. How could a man who is so brilliantly forward-thinking be so completely trapped by the rigid social prejudices of his time? This striking contradiction centers heavily on his new concept of sexual selection. Darwin posited that evolution isn't just driven by survival, eating and not being eaten. It's also driven by the intense struggle to reproduce. He identified two primary mechanisms for sexual selection: male combat and female choice. Male combat makes sense. That's two male moose crashing their antlers together, or two lions fighting for a pride, where the strongest male wins the right to mate, passing on his strong genes. But female choice seems to go against the idea of survival of the fittest. Think of a peacock's tail. A giant, neon-bright, heavy tail makes a bird less fit to escape a predator. It slows the bird down and attracts predators, making it a terrible survival trait. But Darwin realized it is a brilliant reproductive trait. The peahen, the female, actively chooses to mate with the male who has the most spectacular, symmetrical tail. Because she consistently chooses the flashy tail over hundreds of generations. The males evolve to be more and more extravagant, even if it hurts their overall survival. The mechanism driving this isn't the environment. It is the aesthetic preference of the female. The elite, male-dominated Victorian scientific community was absolutely horrified by this idea. They easily accepted male combat because it fit perfectly with their patriarchal view of aggressive, dominant males conquering the weak. But they could not stomach female choice. The idea that female animals possessed an independent aesthetic sense, that they held the ultimate power to select mates and thereby dictate the evolutionary trajectory of an entire species, deeply shocked Victorian sensibilities. They viewed females of all species as passive receptacles, not active decision-makers, rejecting female agency entirely. Darwin held firm for the animal kingdom, insisting female choice was real. Yet when he applied this exact same biological rule to human beings, he did a massive, hypocritical 180-degree flip. Darwin bizarrely flipped his own rule for humans, revealing his most massive blind spot. He argued that somewhere in our evolutionary history, human men had become so powerful that they seized the power of selection away from women. According to Darwin, men were naturally superior to women in body and mind, attaining a higher eminence in whatever they take up. He actually argued that the female peacock gets to choose, but the human woman doesn't, because men are just better. He was a brilliant, objective observer of nature when looking at a beetle or a finch, but when he looked at human society, he abandoned his scientific rigor and simply projected the rigid, sexist gender roles of 19th century Victorian England directly onto our evolutionary past. He assumed his culture, the Victorian patriarchy, was the natural, biological culmination of human development. And it wasn't just gender where his vision was clouded. His views on race were equally complex, contradictory, and deeply tethered to his era. In the 1860s, there was a fierce scientific debate: polygenism versus monogenism. Polygynists, like the members of the deeply racist Anthropological Society of London, believed that the different human races were entirely different species with separate biological origins. They argued that a white European and a black African did not share a common ancestor. This pseudoscience was actively used to justify atrocities. The polygynists supported the Confederacy during the American Civil War, using their science to argue that slavery was the natural order because enslaved people were literally a different, lesser species. Darwin fiercely opposed them. He was a staunch monogynist, arguing passionately that all human races, regardless of physical appearance, shared a single common ancestor. Furthermore, Darwin had a deep, lifelong, visceral revulsion for slavery. This hatred was solidified when he witnessed the horrific brutality of slavery firsthand in Brazil during his Beagle voyage. He heard the screams of tortured, enslaved people, and it haunted him his entire life. He believed deeply in the brotherhood of man. But despite his hatred of slavery and his belief in a single human family, Darwin still believed in a strict racial hierarchy. While he believed all humans were one species, he assumed without question that white Europeans were at the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary development, both culturally and intellectually. Eurocentrism crept in heavily. He viewed indigenous populations he encountered, like the people of Tierra del Fuego, as being lower on the evolutionary ladder, closer to our animal ancestors. When trying to explain how different races developed different physical traits, like skin color, he leaned on his theory of sexual selection, arguing that different tribes developed different arbitrary standards of beauty over time. But he could never escape his own deep-seated ethnocentrism. It is a profound reminder that even the most brilliant, paradigm-shifting minds in human history are inescapably tethered to the cultural biases of their era. Darwin could look at a barnacle or a pigeon with perfect, crystalline objectivity. But when he looked at a Victorian woman in a corset or an indigenous person on a shoreline, his vision was completely clouded by the societal water he was swimming in. His applications of those revolutionary theories to human sociology were heavily contaminated by Victorian sexism and Eurocentrism, and we must report that impartially, because both the genius and the bias were part of his reality. As Darwin was categorizing the brutal cruelties and the intricate beauties of the natural world, he was simultaneously grappling with them in his own home. So what does this all mean for his personal life and the deeply emotional tragedy that defined his later years? This brings us to a deeply emotional, very human part of the story. There is a very famous, heartbreaking narrative about Darwin's religion. The story goes that the tragic death of his beloved 10-year-old daughter Annie in 1851 was the singular shattering event that completely destroyed his faith in God. The tale suggests he simply couldn't reconcile a loving God with the agonizing death of his child. Historians call this the Annie hypothesis, and it is incredibly popular because it makes for a very compelling, cinematic, and tragic narrative. We are drawn to the image of the brilliant scientist who loses his favorite daughter, shakes his fist at the heavens in grief, and abandons Christianity forever. This emotional turning point is repeated in almost every biography, and even major big-budget documentaries claim Annie's death was the final nail in the coffin of his faith. But systematically examining the primary historical evidence reveals that this is, yet again, a myth. The primary sources simply do not support that timeline or that causality. Let us look at the real timeline, Darwin's own private autobiography, which he wrote for his family, and his secret notebooks from the late 1830s and 1840s, more than a full decade before Annie fell ill, show that he had already systematically dismantled and lost his Orthodox Christian faith. He explicitly stated in his writings that his disbelief crept over him at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. And here is the crucial phrase he used. He wrote that the rate was so slow that he felt no distress. That is the absolute smoking gun right there. If his loss of faith was caused by the agonizing, drawn-out death of his beloved child, it would be defined by nothing but distress and anguish. It would be a violent rupture, not a slow, painless fade. So, if it wasn't the searing grief of losing Annie, what actually caused Charles Darwin to step away from Christianity? It was a purely intellectual shift, an accumulation of thousands of logical cuts rather than one massive emotional blow. First, he began to deeply question the historicity and the scientific accuracy of the Old Testament. He concluded it was no more to be trusted as literal history than the sacred books of any other ancient culture. Second, his experiences on the Beagle gave him a profound global grasp of comparative anthropology. He lived with and observed countless different cultures around the globe, and he realized that they all had their own deep, unwavering, entirely different religious convictions. He simply couldn't accept the proposition that the specific localized religion he happened to be born into in England was the one exclusive truth, and everyone else on earth was wrong. He also struggled with the sheer, unrelenting cruelty of the natural world. As we explored earlier, natural selection is a brutal, Malthusian process of starvation and death. As his understanding of biology deepened, he realized that nature was driven by mass death, endless competition, and immense suffering. He found it mathematically and philosophically impossible to reconcile that slaughterhouse with the concept of a benevolent, omnipotent, micromanaging creator. He specifically pointed to a very disturbing biological example, the Ichneumonidae wasp. This specific parasitic wasp has a horrific life cycle. It finds a living caterpillar and stings it to paralyze it, but keeps it alive. It then injects its eggs directly into the caterpillar's body. When the wasp larvae hatch, they slowly eat the paralyzed caterpillar, alive from the inside out, instinctively avoiding the vital organs so the caterpillar stays fresh and alive as long as possible. Darwin looked at this terrifying reality and wrote to a friend that he could not persuade himself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have intentionally designed such a demonic, agonizing life cycle. It was utterly incompatible with a God of love. The wasp perfectly illustrates the blind, amoral mechanics of nature. Beyond the biology, there was also a specific theological doctrine that he found morally repulsive. He called it the damnable doctrine. This was the orthodox Christian doctrine of eternal damnation, the idea that anyone who did not actively believe in Christ would burn in hell forever. Darwin wrote that if this doctrine were true, it would mean that his beloved, free-thinking father, his brother, and almost all of his closest scientific friends would be everlastingly punished simply for following the evidence of their own minds. He found that idea completely, fundamentally, morally unacceptable. By the time little Annie fell tragically ill and died in 1851, Darwin was already an established, quiet agnostic. Her death was a devastating, life-altering tragedy that broke his heart. But the historical evidence proves it was not the catalyst for his loss of faith. He had already let that go. What about the very end of his life? There is a persistent, very famous rumor, often called the Lady Hope story, that Darwin, terrified of death, recanted his evolutionary theories and converted back to Christianity on his deathbed. This is entirely fabricated. There is a story published in a religious magazine in 1915, decades after his death, by an evangelist known as Lady Hope, who claimed she visited him and he asked her to sing hymns. Darwin's own children, specifically his daughter Henrietta, who was present at his deathbed, vehemently and publicly repudiated the claim. Darwin remained a resolute agnostic to his dying breath in April 1882. But the irony of his death is incredible. Think about this final narrative arc. Here is a man who systematically dismantled the literal biblical narrative of creation, a man who proved we are cousins to the apes, and a man who described himself clearly as an agnostic. And yet, when he dies, where does the British establishment bury him? He is given a full, majestic state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, one of the most sacred, hallowed sites in the Anglican Church. He is laid to rest right next to Sir Isaac Newton. How does the Church agree to bury the man who killed natural theology? By the 1880s, the intellectual landscape had completely shifted. The British establishment, including many progressive members of the clergy, had largely accepted evolution. They recognized Darwin's sheer, undeniable brilliance. His burial in the abbey was a deeply symbolic, uneasy truce between the powerful, traditional institutions of the church and the rising, undeniable new age of professional science. It was Victorian society finding a way to assimilate a revolutionary, dangerous thinker into their most prestigious, traditional structures, essentially claiming his genius for the empire while smoothing over his radicalism. It is a perfect, poetic encapsulation of his entire life. A man who lived entirely at the intersection of profound contradiction. We have gone from a reluctant, blood-squeamish medical student vomiting over the side of the Beagle for 18 months to a man who secretly studied barnacles for 8 years to build armor, to a reluctant revolutionary pushed into the global spotlight by a feverish letter from a stranger in Indonesia, and finally, to a quiet agnostic buried with the highest religious honors in Westminster Abbey. And through all of that chaos, the one unifying thread of his life is his meticulous, unyielding, almost superhuman observation of the natural world. Even when the conclusions he drew from it terrified him, he followed the evidence no matter where it led. I want to leave you, the listener, pondering this one final thought. If a man as exceptionally observant as Charles Darwin, a man who could see the hidden million-year connection between a finch's beak and the survival of an entire species, a man who could look at a rotting mussel shell on a cliff and read the slow, majestic rise of the Andes Mountains, was still profoundly influenced by his own grief, his societal biases, and his glaring Victorian blind spots, how much of what we consider to be pure, objective science today is still quietly being shaped by the human flaws of the people conducting it? We like to think that the data is perfectly objective, but someone still has to interpret the data. We are all swimming in cultural water we cannot see. If this journey through the messy, fascinating myths and realities of history sparked your curiosity, make sure you hit the like button, share this with a fellow learner, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled so you never miss a moment of the truth behind the legends.